The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has appealed to the warring parties in Sudan to agree a ceasefire over the coming Muslim Eid al-Fitr holiday. More than 300 people have been killed in fighting between the regular army and the rival paramilitary rapid support forces in the capital Khartoum and other areas. Guterres says civilians should be able to find shelter and medical treatment.
A last-minute attempt to leave the city, which has turned into a war zone. People at this bus station in Khartoum are trying to get on one of the few buses still offering their services.
I'm praying for safety and that God ends the bloodshed. We're praying they reach an agreement and God ends bloodshed of all Muslims.
Hopes for a ceasefire were high on Wednesday, but a pause in fighting never came about. Sudan's army says it will not negotiate with the country's rival paramilitary Rapid Support Force group. The generals want a full surrender. It means more suffering for the civilians trapped in the conflict.
According to the health ministry, 20 hospitals have had to shut down because of attacks and lack of supplies. 8 more health centres are at risk of closure because of work overload and a lack of medical personnel. We call on all parties to commit to a sustained humanitarian pause in fighting as soon as possible.
Washington says it's sending more troops to its naval base in Djibouti to prepare for a possible evacuation of US embassy employees. Other nations are reportedly also planning to get their people out.
People have been really kind and helpful to us. At the same time, people have been also getting more and more desperate. I went down to the market below just now to buy some food, and there was a huge fight breaking out. And, as people get more and more desperate, then things get more and more tense. So people's access to resources is dwindling, and, that's when things start turning for the worse.
At a virtual meeting with African and Arab leaders, UN Chief Antonio Guterres called for a 3-day truce starting from Friday, when Muslims mark the end of the holy month of Ramadan. With the fighting on the streets and prospects of a ceasefire unclear, many here are packing their belongings and leave while they still can.
Abiol Waldeng is an East Africa and Sahel regional analyst as well as an international development consultant. Abiol, good to see you. 6 days of fighting and no let-up inside. How did we get here?
Well, as you mentioned, this is the result of the coup d'etat that happened in 2021. These two generals who came together to join the civilian forces 4 years ago to overthrow Bashir, then decided to reverse the civilian leader, the former Prime Minister Abdel Fattah, and claimed that they would eventually seek a civilian transition. But they've been pushing it off, they've been delaying it, and in the meantime, the Sudanese economy has been suffering greatly. And as such, here we are today. The two different factions are fighting each other because they know that eventually one of them has to be on top. Just because the economic situation can no longer wait for this.
Did this come as much of a surprise to observers?
Absolutely. As someone who knows Sudan very well and who knows the region very well, what is the most shocking about what's going on right now is just the level of violence. In the past, we've never seen this type of fighting within Khartoum. I heard earlier on your report, urban warfare. This is what, having spoken to people in Khartoum today, they've described door-to-door shooting, people being thrown out of their apartments, as the fighting moves block to block, every level of artillery, from tanks to helicopter gunships to fighter jets, snipers. And moreover, one of the biggest issues is that the ceasefires so far have not been able to hold. There was one today that lasted from 1 to 6 p.m., according to one of the people I know in Khartoum. but it's already been broken, and the fighting has resumed, not just in Khartoum, but also in the neighboring city of Omdurman.
Why are these ceasefires not holding?
The reason is because both forces, to be honest, it's almost like a race to the bottom. Both forces, they claim that they care, but the reality is they're both fighting for supremacy. They're both fighting to win. I spoke to a relative of mine who is in Sudan who said this is really a zero fight. One of the sides has to win. They know the international community is going to push whichever side comes out victorious to make some compromises, but neither of them want to be the side that makes the compromises. So as such, they're actually there's a lot of evidence, they're using the ceasefires to reinforce their positions. And as such, there is no real ceasefire. There haven't been any ceasefires that have lasted even 24 hours. And this is all in the context of the last 10 days of Ramadan, which normally are extremely holy for Muslims.
Yeah, there is a doubt about whether or not the army and the RSF leader have their fighters under control, especially when they agree to a ceasefire, but then the fighting continues. How dangerous could that be?
I think it's extremely dangerous, and I think it's very important that you mentioned that this is one of the elements, is the lack of control of their own fighters. I would stress that, particularly for the RSF, this is a paramilitary group. It started as a group of irregulars, and getting them under control will probably be even more difficult than getting the Sudanese regular army under control. So this is definitely one of the issues. Also, each faction has to satisfy the demands to a certain extent of their paymasters, the different countries that are also involved in financing them. So the deadliness and the lethality of what's going on is most likely going to increase, just because there isn't enough reason for either side to give up right now. They have already in the past decided that they didn't mind the country not receiving financial aid, not receiving, not having its debts erased. And at this point, they know that they're at the critical hour, and as such, they're really fighting to the end.
Yeah. Now that you mention international actors, what has their role been in the lead up to this, and what could the international community maybe do to solve this crisis?
Well, the international community, Sudan was taken off of the terrorist list under Hamdok, and things were beginning to normalize. Sudan was beginning to be able to access aid through international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. And, things were starting off on the right foot in order to repair some of the damage that was wrought to the economy by al-Bashir, and also by the loss of South Sudan, which, is oil rich and provided quite a lot of money for Sudan. The issue is that both generals decided that rather than have a real civilian transition, they wanted to make sure that one of them was in charge, and so they've allowed the economy to suffer. I think the international community has done its best to try to ensure that there is some financial punishment for both sides. But right now, in order to stop things, I think it's two steps. One, there absolutely has to be a ceasefire. I've spoken to people who have talked about being trapped in buildings for 4 or 5 days. Indiscriminate fighting, indiscriminate shooting, not necessarily targeted, but just lawlessness. One of the things that I also will say is a hallmark of how bad it is like, for example, phone lines haven't been cut. Traditionally in Sudan, when there's a coup d'etat, it's one group that comes, takes over, gets on TV, and then cuts the phone lines and such. But that hasn't even happened because it's just kind of an all-out war in which no side really has control. And in fact, one of the things that keeps coming back to me from people on the ground is, I don't know who's in control right now. I'm not sure which force is in charge.
Yeah.
So I think the international community has to push for a ceasefire.
We don't have much time, but I do want to know how destabilizing a bigger conflict in Sudan could be for the entire region.
Absolutely, very, very devastating, particularly for the two countries that have the longest borders with Sudan, which is South Sudan and Ethiopia. Clearly, Sudan is opposed to the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. And also for South Sudan, which is an oil-dependent economy, South Sudan receives about 90% of its GDP from oil. and all of that transits through Sudan. So South Sudan has already been fragilized by civil war, and a sharp drop in humanitarian aid due to the Ukraine crisis is dependent on that oil, and most likely is not receiving the oil now. And all of this at a time in which there's heavy inflation in both Sudan and South Sudan. So it has a potential to spark a very, very big regional crisis, not just with refugees and economy, but also with fighting.
International Development Consultant Abiol Lual Deng, thank you so much for your time.